The soldier returned home after his service and went to the cemetery to visit his friend's grave. But when he noticed strange coins on the gravestone and learned their true meaning, he couldn't hold back his tears. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching from. The weeks that followed his return from service passed like a haze, as though the world around him had been drained of color and filled again with something faint, washed out, incapable of holding his attention. He was home now, the thing he had dreamed about through sleepless nights in the desert and endless drills in mud-soaked training fields. Yet instead of joy or comfort, he found himself disoriented. The streets of his town looked familiar but strange. The houses were the same but somehow more fragile, as if he were seeing them through another man's eyes. People smiled at him, some shook his hand, a few thanked him for his service, and yet all of it felt detached. They could never understand what it meant to carry the weight of silence after gunfire, or to live with the images of comrades who would never again set foot on these streets. At night he lay awake in his childhood bedroom, staring at the same ceiling he had known as a boy, but the shadows on it took different shapes now. In the stillness he would hear echoes, an explosion at a distance, shouted orders, the crack of a rifle, and then the silence afterward, the silence that pressed harder than the noise ever had. When he did sleep, he dreamed of faces. His friend's face came to him most often, sometimes smiling as he had in the barracks, sometimes pale and lifeless. The final memory that haunted him most of all, he would wake in a sweat, clutching at the sheets, fighting the urge to believe he was back there, crouched in dust waiting for the next command. His family tried their best. His mother cooked his favorite meals, his father spoke proudly of him to neighbors, his sister dragged him out to movies and coffee shops, as if routine could mend what war had broken. Yet he sat quietly, pushing food around his plate, sipping his coffee without tasting it, unable to follow the plots of films. Conversations about college classes, about work schedules, about which neighbors had moved away. These all sounded like whispers from another world. He nodded politely, but his mind wandered elsewhere, to tents in heat and nights under alien skies, to the last words exchanged with the one man he had trusted most. He carried that absence like a wound. The friend he had leaned on during training, the one who had shared cigarettes during midnight watches, who had spoken of the girl waiting for him back home, of plans for a workshop he wanted to open one day, all of it was gone. And with that loss, the world at home seemed less solid, less real. He wanted to visit the grave, but each time the thought rose, fear smothered it. To stand before that white stone would mean to accept it fully. It would mean the end of denial, the end of pretending that maybe he was still out there somewhere. The days dragged on, and he found himself walking the town aimlessly, past shops and parks, seeing familiar places through a film of detachment. Veterans he passed sometimes nodded at him, and in their eyes he caught a reflection of himself, men who had come home but never fully returned. It was after one such meeting, a brief exchange of glances with an older man outside the grocery store, that he felt the decision take root. Without words, the look had told him, "Go. It is time." The cemetery lay on the edge of town, a national ground where soldiers rested in endless rows. He had been there once as a boy, on Memorial Day, when the grass was green and flags fluttered, but he had not understood then the weight of those stones. Now, as he approached, he felt each step heavier than the last. The air seemed quieter near the gates, as if the world itself paused in respect. He stopped for a moment before entering, steadying his breath, his palms damp. Inside, the order of the place struck him with force. Rows upon rows of white markers stretched outward, perfectly aligned, like men standing in formation. There was no chaos here, no brokenness, only solemn precision. Each stone bore a name, dates, sometimes a few carved words chosen by family. Together they formed a sea of silence, and in that silence he felt the presence of countless lives, each one cut short, each one carrying its own story into the earth. The wind moved softly through the trees at the boundary, carrying the faint rustle of leaves, and the sound was so delicate that he slowed his steps instinctively, as though he were intruding on something sacred. He walked down the gravel path, shoes crunching softly. Every so often, he caught sight of small tokens left by visitors' flowers, faded ribbons, even photographs sealed in plastic. They added color to the white field, fragile proofs that the fallen were remembered. His heart clenched at the thought of families who had stood here, hands pressed to stone, tears soaking the grass. He wondered if his friend's parents had come often, if they had left something behind for him. As he moved deeper among the rows, memories began to rise. He remembered their first days in boot camp, how the drill sergeants had broken them down with relentless commands, and how he and his friend had laughed in exhaustion afterward, realizing that the only way to survive was together. He recalled the nights overseas when they had shared stories of home, when his friend had spoken of his fiance's letters, carrying them folded in his pocket like treasures. He remembered the last day, the chaos, the sound that still rang in his ears, and the sight that had etched itself forever in his mind. The path curved, leading him toward the section where he knew his friend's grave lay. With each step, the air seemed heavier, as though grief itself pressed down on him. He slowed, reluctant and eager at once, dreading and needing what lay ahead. The rows blurred in his vision, his breath shallow. He told himself he would be strong, but strength had abandoned him before, and might again. Then at last he reached the row. His eyes scanned the stones, moving over names until one stopped him cold. There it was, the name carved in clean letters, unyielding, permanent. The date of birth he knew well, the date of death that had changed his life. His knees felt weak. He sank slowly to the grass, staring at the stone, unable to look away. It was real. It was final. No dream, no false hope could alter it. And as he sat there trembling, his eyes caught something unexpected. On the flat top of the stone, glinting faintly in the muted sunlight, lay coins. Not one, but several, arranged as though placed carefully by unseen hands. They were small, ordinary things, yet they pulled at him with sudden force, as if they carried voices he could almost hear. He reached toward them instinctively, then stopped, hand hovering. The sight unsettled him, filling him with questions he could not answer. Who had left them? What did they mean? Why here on this stone, on his friend's grave? He stared, his thoughts clouded, torn between the grief that gripped him and the strange intrigue that began to stir. The silence of the cemetery deepened around him, as if waiting. He sat motionless, heart beating fast, aware that he had stepped into something larger than his grief alone. Something was being told to him in a language he did not yet understand. The coins waited patiently for him to listen. And there, in the quiet wait of that moment, the road to understanding slowly began. For a long moment he simply stared at the coins resting atop the headstone, his hand still hovering in hesitation, as though to touch them might disturb something sacred. The muted sunlight caught the edges of the metal and made them shimmer faintly, dull copper and worn silver, reflecting a quiet message he could not yet decipher. His breath slowed as he leaned closer, reading the details. A penny darkened with age, a nickel still bearing the faint outline of Jefferson's profile, and a dime, thin and almost weightless in appearance. They had not been tossed there in carelessness. They were arranged deliberately, placed with purpose, and though they were nothing more than ordinary currency, he felt as though they carried a meaning far greater than their simple form. His chest tightened. Others had been here before him. Others who had known his friend, who had cared enough to come and leave these small tokens. The realization cut through him with conflicting force. Relief rose because it meant his friend had not been forgotten, that he was still remembered by others beyond himself. But mingled with it was something sharper, a pang of jealousy, perhaps even resentment. He had thought his grief was his alone, that no one could understand the depth of it, and now these coins suggested a network of invisible mourners, people who had touched his friend's life in ways he might never know. It unsettled him to think of it, yet it also filled him with a strange, aching comfort. He lowered his hand, letting it rest on the cool white stone, tracing the letters of his friend's name as though grounding himself. The coins remained above, silent witnesses to emotions he struggled to contain. He wanted to ask questions aloud, to demand explanations from the empty air, but no words formed. The cemetery was still, expectant, and all he could hear was the faint stirring of wind through grass and the occasional caw of a crow somewhere distant. Slowly he rose to his feet, glancing around at the other markers stretching out in perfect symmetry. It was then that he noticed it, the faint glint of more coins scattered across many of the stones, dotting the cemetery like secret signals hidden in plain sight. His eyes widened as he began to move among them, drawn from one to the next. On some markers there was only a single penny, its copper dulled and weather-worn. On others he found dimes, shining brighter, their edges catching the light. Here and there he saw nickels, heavier, more solid, and occasionally quarters resting alone in solemn dignity. He crouched beside one stone, then another, his fingers hovering but never touching, as if afraid he might erase their meaning if he disturbed them. The pattern was undeniable. These were not offerings left at random. There was a language being spoken here, quiet and unrecorded, but undeniable. Each coin carried weight, not in value but in symbolism, and though he did not yet fully understand it, the realization took hold of him with growing certainty. As he wandered deeper among the rows, his steps grew slower, more reverent. His heart beat steadily, no longer with the frantic disorientation of earlier, but with a dawning awareness that he was in the midst of something profound. He paused before a stone that bore the name of a soldier long gone, a man who had died decades earlier, and upon it lay nothing but a single penny, dark as earth. It was simple, humble, but the intent was clear. Someone had been here. Someone had remembered. He felt the weight of that gesture press into him. The penny said without words, "You are not forgotten." A few markers away, another grave bore a dime, and he lingered there as well. The dime, small but brighter, seemed to carry a different message, something closer, more personal. It suggested companionship, shared experience, and as he studied it, he thought again of the coins on his friend's stone. A penny, a nickel, a dime. Each one meant something, he was sure of it, and together they formed a story he could almost grasp but not yet fully hold. His mind turned back to memories, to moments in training when older soldiers had spoken of traditions, half-remembered customs whispered in the barracks. Had someone once mentioned coins on graves? He tried to recall, but the fragments were vague. At the time, he had not listened closely, too focused on his own exhaustion and the next day's demands. Now those fragments returned, teasing him with the possibility of meaning. He walked for what felt like hours, tracing the silent code spread across the cemetery. Each coin he saw deepened the impression that this was not just chance. It was ritual, an unspoken agreement carried by those who remembered. And as he returned at last to his friend's grave, he found his gaze fixed on the 3 coins that waited for him there. They seemed different now, no longer mysterious intrusions, but part of a larger pattern. He crouched once more, studying them with new reverence. The penny whispered of simple recognition, respect from someone who may not have known him well, but cared enough to leave proof of their visit. The nickel suggested a bond forged in training, a memory of sweat and struggle endured together. The dime carried the weight of shared service, the closeness of those who had fought side by side. And though he did not see a quarter among them, he shivered at the thought of what that might mean. The unbearable closeness of being there in the final moment. The air seemed heavier around him, the silence richer. He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts tangled but insistent. These coins were not for him, not directly, but in them he felt included, connected. They told him his friend's story did not end with death, that threads of remembrance stretched outward into lives he might never know, binding them together in grief and honor. For the first time since stepping into the cemetery, he did not feel entirely alone. The weight of his loss remained, but it was no longer only his burden to carry. He sat back in the grass, legs folded beneath him, and let the quiet seep into him. His eyes drifted over the rows, catching glimpses of metal here and there, tiny sparks of memory left behind by unseen hands. The whole place seemed alive with silent conversations, each coin a word, each row a paragraph in a book of remembrance too vast for any one person to read. He thought of the families who came here, mothers and fathers, wives and children, placing coins with trembling hands. He thought of veterans like himself, drawn back by memory, compelled to leave behind tokens that spoke when words failed. The cemetery was not only a resting place, but a dialogue, an exchange across time and silence. As the sun lowered and shadows grew longer across the grass, he remained seated at his friend's grave, coins gleaming faintly above the carved letters. The day was fading, but his mind was alive with realization. What had begun as confusion now settled into the certainty that these small pieces of metal were more than mere currency. They were fragments of memory, signals of respect, pieces of a language that required no dictionary. And though he did not yet know the full extent of their meanings, he felt their truth. They mattered. They meant his friend was remembered. They meant he himself was not alone. And in that understanding, though fragile and incomplete, something within him shifted. The coins on the stone seemed to wait, patient and steady, promising more to reveal. And as he rose to leave the cemetery for the evening, the questions in his heart did not weigh him down as before. Instead, they beckoned him forward toward a deeper understanding yet to come. Even as he left the cemetery that evening, the images of the coins followed him home, persistent and unyielding. In the silence of his room, he could see them still, resting on the white stone, carrying meanings he could feel but not yet fully put into words. He lay in bed restless, the faint gleam of copper and silver haunting the corners of his thoughts. By morning, he knew he could not resist returning. The questions had grown too heavy to ignore, and the need to find clarity pulled him back toward those endless rows of markers. When he stepped once more through the gates the following day, the place felt different. It was not just a ground of grief now, but a text written in symbols, waiting to be read. His eyes sought the coins instinctively, catching their gleams from stone to stone. Each one seemed to speak a fragment of a sentence, and though he could not yet translate it fully, he sensed the pattern, the depth of the tradition that had been unfolding here long before he noticed it. He returned to his friend's grave and lowered himself again into the grass. The coins were still there, untouched since yesterday, their presence steady and patient. He traced the carved letters on the stone with his fingertips, and as he did, memories began to stir with greater force. He recalled snatches of conversations from his service, old stories shared in barracks when the nights were too long and the silence too oppressive. Someone had once mentioned coins on graves, he remembered now. Not in detail, but as a passing remark, a hint that such tokens carried layered meanings known only among soldiers. At the time, he had laughed it off, too tired to care. Now he leaned into that memory, desperate to retrieve what had seemed unimportant then, but was essential now. Slowly, the puzzle began to form in his mind. A penny, he could almost hear the words, was a sign of simple respect, a way for anyone to acknowledge the sacrifice. A nickel, heavier and more solid, spoke of shared struggle and training, of the bond forged in those first brutal weeks when men were broken down and rebuilt. A dime was left by those who had served alongside the fallen, a mark of brotherhood in the field, of shared danger and trust. And a quarter. He shuddered as the realization crept in, was a sign that someone had been present when the soldier had died. A gesture as heavy as it was sorrowful. He stared at the coins again. A penny, a nickel, a dime. The story was clear now. His friend's grave had been visited by someone who had trained with him, who had served with him, who had remembered him with respect. They had left pieces of their memory behind, coded in small metal tokens, so that anyone who came after would know he was not alone in his service, nor in his death. The understanding pierced him with new intensity. His chest tightened, and he closed his eyes, letting the memories flood him. He saw the long days of boot camp, the blisters on his feet, the sting of shouted orders, the exhaustion that left them sprawled on bunks with aching muscles. He remembered his friend at his side, grimacing through pain but laughing anyway, turning misery into camaraderie. That nickel on the stone was not just metal. It was the echo of those days, the proof that someone else had endured them alongside him. Then came the dime, and with it the memories of their deployment. He could see the endless stretches of sand, the heat that pressed down like a weight, the nights when the stars seemed sharp enough to cut. He heard again the whispers they shared when the world was quiet, speaking of home, of love, of the lives they hoped to reclaim when it was over. The dime was the embodiment of that service, of the unspoken trust that bound them in those moments. The penny was simplest, but it carried weight too. It told him that others, perhaps strangers, had come to honor his friend, to show that his sacrifice mattered even to those who had never known his voice or his smile. It reminded him that memory stretched beyond the circle of comrades into the broader fabric of a nation that recognized its fallen. But the quarter was absent, and for that he was almost grateful. Its meaning was too heavy, too sharp, and though he himself had been there in those final moments, he could not bear to imagine seeing such a token left by another. He carried that memory alone. The sight of his friend's last breath burned into him, the helplessness of it, the guilt that never left. That burden was his, in his alone. He stayed there for hours, letting the current of remembrance wash over him. Each coin became a key that unlocked another door in his mind, doors he had long tried to keep sealed. He saw his friend smile, heard his voice, felt the weight of his presence beside him in trenches and in moments of rare laughter. The cemetery around him blurred as his focus turned inward, and the coins anchored him, grounding his grief in something tangible, something that felt less isolating. Gradually, a shift occurred within him. The sharp edge of loss softened, not because the pain was gone, but because he realized it was shared. The coins told him that others carried their own fragments of grief, their own memories of the man he mourned. He was not the sole custodian of that loss. He was part of a web of remembrance, unseen but present, bound together by the silent language of coins on stone. He leaned back in the grass, looking up at the sky. The clouds drifted slowly, pale against the blue, and he thought of the countless men and women whose names lay carved in stone around him. Each one had a story, each one a circle of mourners, leaving behind tokens to speak what could not be said aloud. The cemetery was not only a place of endings, it was a place of connection, where grief and honor intersected in rituals that sustained the living. For the first time since his return, he felt a measure of peace settle over him. The ache remained, but it no longer crushed him with the same solitary weight. The understanding of the coins had given him a bridge between himself and others, between the living and the dead, between memory and acceptance. He sat quietly as the day lengthened, letting that realization sink deep. When he finally rose to leave, he glanced once more at the coins. They glinted faintly in the afternoon light, unchanged, eternal in their simplicity. He knew now what they meant. And more importantly, he knew they carried not only the memory of his friend, but also a reminder to himself that he did not carry this burden alone. Others had come, others would come, and together they would weave the silent tapestry of remembrance. As he walked away, the rows of stones no longer seemed so stark. They were voices in a choir too vast to hear fully, yet their presence was undeniable. And though he carried sorrow still, it was tempered now with something new understanding, in the faint but steady comfort of belonging to a tradition that stretched far beyond himself. The day after his long vigil at the cemetery, he awoke with a heaviness in his chest that felt different from the days before. It was not the familiar, suffocating grief that had dogged him since his return, but something quieter, steadier, as though the weight had settled into a shape he could finally hold without crumbling beneath it. He thought again of the coins on his friend's grave, of the penny, the nickel, the dime, and the absence of the quarter. Their meanings had come alive for him, each one a thread in a larger tapestry of remembrance. Yet he felt that something still remained unfinished. It was not enough simply to understand the tokens. He knew he had to leave one of his own. For hours he sat at the small desk in his room, fingers running absent-mindedly over the contents of an old box he had kept from his service. Inside were letters stained with sand, photographs folded at the corners, and trinkets he had carried across oceans and deserts. Among them lay the coin he had kept through it all, a simple quarter he had chosen at random years ago, but had never parted with. He had carried it in his pocket through training, through deployment, through nights when fear pressed down so heavily that he needed the feel of it to remind him of something ordinary, something solid. That coin had been his talisman, his anchor in a world where nothing was certain. As he held it now, the edges worn smooth by his touch, he realized what he had to do. The quarter was more than currency. It was a piece of himself, the embodiment of years lived side by side with the man whose name was now carved in stone. To part with it would hurt, but that was the point. To leave it would be to release not the memory, but the weight of trying to carry it all alone. When he returned to the cemetery, the air was cool with the promise of evening. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the rows of markers, and the silence felt deeper than ever, as though the world itself hushed to witness what he had come to do. He walked with measured steps, each one echoing in his chest, until at last he stood again before his friend's grave. The coins were still there, unchanged, their dull gleams steady in the fading light. He knelt, his hand trembling slightly as he reached into his pocket. The quarter lay warm in his palm, familiar and reluctant to leave him. For a long time he only stared at it, the memories rushing back with unbearable clarity. He remembered the training yard, the laughter that cut through exhaustion, the desert nights when they had spoken of futures that would never come to pass. He remembered the last day, the chaos and the silence that followed, and the unshakable guilt that had shadowed him since. All of it pulsed within the weight of the coin, and to set it down felt like surrendering a part of himself. At last, with a breath that shuddered through him, he placed it gently on the stone, alongside the penny, the nickel, and the dime. The 4 coins sat together now, each with its own story, each with its own voice. He felt a surge of emotion, sharp and overwhelming, as though the act had opened something inside him. But instead of collapsing beneath the weight, he felt a release, a loosening of the knots that had bound him since that terrible day. The coin was no longer his alone. It was part of something greater, a testament not only to his friend's life and death, but to the bond they had shared, the bond that no grave could erase. Tears blurred his vision as he sat back in the grass, yet for the first time they did not drown him in despair. They felt cleansing, even necessary, carrying away some of the darkness that had clung to him. He realized then that he had been holding on to the quarter all these years, because he was afraid that without it, he would forget, that his friend would slip away from him entirely. But the truth was different. Memory did not live in objects. It lived in him, in every laugh recalled, every scar carried, every silence that echoed at night. By leaving the coin behind, he had not lost anything. He had gained the strength to carry those memories without being crushed by them. As the sky darkened, he rose slowly to his feet. The cemetery looked different now, not as a place of endless endings, but as a vast landscape of remembrance, where each coin, each flower, each token left behind wove a web of connection between the living and the dead. He saw not just grief but love etched into the fabric of the place, a collective vow that none of the names carved in stone would ever vanish into nothingness so long as someone remembered. He walked down the path, his steps lighter than they had been in months. The rows of white markers no longer seemed to weigh on him with their uniformity. Instead, they seemed to march with him, silent companions in his journey forward. The world outside the cemetery gates was still uncertain, still strange, but he no longer felt entirely estranged from it. He carried with him the knowledge that he was part of something larger, that his grief was shared, that remembrance was a bond stronger than isolation. As he reached the gates, he paused one last time and looked back. The grave of his friend lay somewhere among the rows, indistinguishable from the others at this distance. Yet he knew it now carried his quarter, his gesture, his voice added to the chorus of memory. That was enough. It would remain there long after he was gone, a part of the story written in coins and silence. He turned and stepped into the fading light, no longer haunted in the same way. The pain would never vanish, but it no longer consumed him. It had become part of the path he would walk, a reminder of love, of sacrifice, of brotherhood. And as he moved forward into the evening, he carried not only sorrow, but also a quiet strength, a promise to live in a way that honored the man whose name he would never forget. The world was still waiting for him, and at last he felt ready to meet it. Don't miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button right now so you're always first to see our latest stories. And if this video hooked you, check out the next one waiting for you on the screen. You won't believe what happens there. Share this video with your friends so they can join the mystery too. Let's see how many of them can handle the shock.